Hello, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance and welcome to my 5.5 Floor 12 Abyss Guide. I'm also doing a Floor 11 Abyss Guide as a separate video this time around, so if you'd like to see that, feel free to go check it out. I'm also moving the general Abyss tips I normally have in this video to that video, as it feels more apparent for those more unfamiliar with how the Abyss works. Anyway, looking at Floor 12, we're breaking HP records again with 12-2 because the HP multiplier is different this Abyss. How this usually works in Abyss is not only do enemies have harder mechanics, sometimes higher resistances, especially bosses, but they also have much higher HP than the overworld. This HP in Abyss takes their overworld HP and it's multiplied by an arbitrary number consistent within a floor, depending on the amount of enemies they put in Abyss and how the developers want to tune the balance to make it the right difficulty for players. Last Abyss we had lots of multi-wave into boss chambers, and so the multiplier was only 300% or 3 times the health. This time, because there's less enemies, the multiplier is 375%. So even though we have an identical boss as last Abyss in the Automaton, this time it has about a quarter more HP. As always, if you have any thoughts, tips, advice, feel free to put them in the comments, and any missing information or incorrect notes will be pinned. And lastly, before we get into things, I also have a little ad. Well, it's not really sponsored, I just wanted to share some Genshin merch that a friend who'd made me some stream assets in the past is making, and so I wanted to support them. They're these little wiggling enamel pins, which I think are rather cute. So if you've wanted to get yourself some Genshin merch in the past, the Kickstarter literally starts today on the release of this video. Anyway, let's get back into the Abyss. So, the general tips. This section, again, has moved to the Floor 11 video, so if you want to go check that, go do that there. So instead, we'll move right on to the Abyss Blessings and the Leyline Disorders, before then going into the individual chambers. The Abyss Blessing for this Abyss is for cryo-related reactions. As usual, this is a shockwave of true damage, but instead of being released at your location, it will be released at the opponent's location this time, and this can only be triggered every 4 seconds, which means you don't need a lot of cryo application. Things like melt teams with Sitlali or Rosaria will make as much use of this as cryo driver teams. Cryo damage focused teams are definitely less popular in the current meta apart from melt. They definitely deal less damage than a lot of teams, but they're still viable. But we'll look into all of the team building stuff at the end of the video like we normally do. But what about the Leyline Disorders? Because they're making a return as always, so for first half we have 75% skill geo damage. That will be really amazing for Navia teams because most of her damage is skill damage. Of course, Albedo and Chiori can also make very good use of this because most of their damage is skill damage. Ito and Kachina's skill damage are still important parts of their kit, maybe not as significant, but as we said, team building later. On the second half, we have Elemental Cryo skill damage increased by 75%, which is a bit of a weird one. This is mainly because we don't really have any characters in the game that do big cryo skill damage. I even looked at the Anemo characters to see if any of their infusions could make use of this, but no, there's not really any character that does a significant amount of cryo skill damage as part of their kit. So obviously this seems like it probably will be designed for Escoffier if she is a cryo character and she does a good amount of skill damage. But it's very strange that they're giving this Abyss Blessing now when most of this Abyss will feature in this patch and not next patch. So really, this is just making Abyss quite a lot harder because you can't make use of the Leyline Disorder. This also means it won't be worth considering when I get into the team building section. So let's hop into Chamber 12-1. Of course, we'll go over the general tips for the chamber as a whole, then go into the individual halves, and then go to the enemies specifically and how they work. So as you can see, this is mostly single target content. We have bosses on both halves, and on the second half we have 2 waves. But that means that grouping and multi-target focused abilities won't be very useful here because there's nothing to group. As always, the key for this will be suggestion, recommendation, requirement, where requirements are things which means you'll likely miss 3 stars if you don't fulfill it. Recommendations is fulfilling mechanics that will help you defeat the enemies in a short amount of time, but isn't absolutely necessary if you have strong teams to clear within 3 stars. And lastly, suggestions don't really have an effect on the time that it takes you, but it will make the combat easier. Let's look at side 1 or the first half specifically. So here we have the return of the boss, the Hydro Tulpa. Of course, this enemy is completely immune to hydro damage, so you can't in any way rely on hydro damage as your main source, and there will also be a mechanic where bringing some form of cryo, pyro, dendro, or electro will help you deal with it. So the Hydro Tulpa, as we've been over, is immune to hydro, and all of its attacks are hydro based. This means you need to be careful with a character like Bennett who will self-infuse you with pyro, because then the enemy will get free vaporizers, increasing the damage they do. This is especially dangerous if you're playing someone like Arlecchino, because she's quite good into this chamber, but obviously she has no healing, so you're much more vulnerable to damage. Another big aspect to the Tulpa is that it has a constant Hydro aura. So let's take a look at what benefits this can bring. Prominently, you get free reactions. You don't need to apply any Hydro from any Hydro characters to be able to trigger any Hydro reactions on it. This means you're not relying on someone like Xingqiu to apply Hydro at a good rate, you just get free Hydro reactions all the time. And secondly, you don't need to worry about consuming too much Hydro. So, a character that doesn't apply Hydro as quickly might be like Kundus, and maybe if you do too many Pyro hits with your teammates, you will remove that Hydro, but because this has a constant Hydro aura, you don't need to worry about having too many Vaporizers, too many reactions where it will wipe the aura because it will just regenerate it. So of course for characters like Auron you will get lots of free Electro Charge. That means that if you're running him in an Overload team where he normally wouldn't work as well because you're not triggering that reaction, you'll be able to do it in this chamber. You'll also get lots of Crystallizers if you're playing Navia. You don't have to worry about the application on the enemy having an aura to be able to get Crystallizers when you apply Geo. Bloom teams and Hydro teams will generate blooms every time they apply Dendro. This also will mean the Bloom teams work slightly differently in this Abyss. To explain it, I need to talk a little bit about how elemental reactions happen and how units and gauge theory work. So when you apply an element on an enemy, they get an aura. And when you apply another element on an enemy, you get a reaction, right? But when that second element is applied, different elements will remove different amounts of the aura that you have on the enemy. This is how you end up getting things like forward and reverse reactions. So let's take an example. Say you have some Pyro on an enemy and you apply Hydro. Because this is a Hydro reaction, because it's effective, you're putting out a fire, it's going to remove a lot of the Pyro, so it will always remove 2 units worth of Pyro. Meaning if you have Pyro on the enemy and you trigger a Vaporize, the Pyro will disappear. And that's called a forward reaction. Normally they also give you a bigger multiplier. But we won't worry about that here. So instead the enemy has Pyro on them and you apply Cryo. Because Cryo is a reverse reaction, here instead of removing 2 units, so you remove all of the Pyro that exists, you only remove half a unit because it's a reverse reaction. This means that the Pyro will continue to exist on the enemy and you can get another melt on the enemy. So even though the reaction multiplier is lower, you're getting 2 reactions for the price of 1 unit of Pyro. I needed to explain that for Dendro because Bloom works the same way. If you have Dendro on the enemy, and you apply Hydro to them, then you remove 0.5 and you'll get a Bloom from it. That's why usually in Nilou Bloom teams you'll have a Kokomi or an Ayato or someone like that driving, because you'll get 2 Blooms for every 1 bit of Dendro you put on the enemy. Whereas if you look at the other way around, if you have Hydro on the enemy and you apply Dendro, it removes 2 units of Hydro. So 1 application of Hydro only ends up giving you 1 Bloom. So it's less value. This is particularly apparent this Abyss because the enemy has a constant Hydro aura and you don't need to worry about it disappearing. This means you don't need to worry about your Hydro application and you can apply as much Dendro as you want to, and every time you're applying Dendro you're getting a Bloom from it, which means you'll get more value if you run, say, Nilou and 3 Dendro characters, specifically against these enemies that will always have a Hydro aura. That also means that those Dendro characters are then triggering the reaction, so they need to build the Elemental Mastery instead of the Hydro character. Hopefully that gave you some insights and some information. If you have more questions, feel free to ask. I love explaining this stuff in detail if you can't tell already. The last thing I wanted to touch on was also free Vaporizers. This means someone like Xiangling, who famously has no ICD, is able to get Vaporize on every single hit of her burst. In fact, against larger bosses like this, because Xiangling's burst counts every so often when it's in proximity of an enemy, it's able to hit the boss twice as it spins round it. Once when it first enters the hitbox and once when it's exiting the hitbox, because it's so big and it ends up counting for so long. More significantly than that, Overload teams, where you have someone like Arlecchino, will work. This is because Hydra and Electro can coexist on an enemy. So when you apply Pyro, you're getting both an Electro reaction, so an Overload, and a Hydro reaction, so a Vaporize. And so you might think, okay, well if I'm getting lots of Vaporizes in an Overload team, let's build some Elemental Mastery on those Pyro characters. Well, I need to touch on this specifically as well. This will only be useful in this first chamber. So if you're building characters just to defeat this first chamber, then that's fine. But in the second chamber, because there's no constant Hydro aura on the enemy, all of that Elemental Mastery will kind of be wasted because you're not triggering as many reactions. So I would recommend building a more universal build so attack will be valuable in either chamber. Of course, you're free to do non-continuous runs though to get the most stars if you need to do that. So that's one bad point to this enemy, that different builds might not work for it. Let's talk about some of the other bad conditions to a constant Hydro Aura. Well, first of all, you can't react with anything apart from Electro and Hydro, because they're the only elements that can coexist on an enemy at the same time. This is because when you apply Electro and Hydro to an enemy, it creates an Electro charge reaction, which slowly depletes the amount of Electro and Hydro on the enemy until it's all gone, doing ticks of damage over time. Because it's constantly depleting, it also means it does disappear quite quickly. So if you want to swirl Electro on an enemy, and you're using a character like Xian Yun, you do her jump in the air and then her plunge down for her skill, that can take quite a lot of time, and by the time you finish that, Electro might have disappeared on the enemy. So if you want to secure a reaction, make sure to apply your element quite quickly after the Electro has been applied. But apart from Electro, all the other elements get instantly consumed. Dendro becomes blooms, Pyro becomes vaporizes, Cryo becomes a freeze, which then disappears because it's a boss, so it doesn't count. If you don't already know, bosses can't be frozen, so anything that happens with a Cryo Aura will instantly disappear on a boss. And because freeze does no damage, you're not really getting anything from it other than triggering the reaction. This means it's more difficult for characters with sets like Viridescent Venera or Scroll or Archaic Petra to buff certain elements, as they'll only be able to react off their own element and the enemy's elements, which are only Hydro or Electro. So for example, Kachina with Scroll would never be able to buff Pyro because she can never make a Pyro crystalline. Yan-san, on the other hand, if she was in an Electro team, can buff the Electro damage because she's Electro, but she couldn't buff Pyro. She can buff Dendro though, because what will happen with Dendro is you'll instantly create a Bloom Seed, and then Ian-san will hopefully react with that Bloom Seed, creating a Hyper Bloom, which buffs Dendro and Electro. I'll talk more about Hyper Bloom in the team section when we go over spread teams for this particular Abyss, but I will mention here that you can use the Hydro Aura to get more Hyper Blooms, in the same way that you get more of any other reaction. And that should be everything related to the Hydro Aura, but that's just the aura. Let's talk about the mechanics of the boss themselves. The main mechanic of the Hydro Tulpa is that every 12 seconds or so, around that, it will summon a mini or a half Tulpa. The same thing, just different names. We'll go over the stats of them and how to defeat them later, but first I want to go over the mechanic where it will try to absorb one of the mini Tulpas. It will generally move itself over to a side of the arena where one is close to it. So if you know exactly where the mini Tulpas are, you can kind of predict when it's going to do this animation. It will then try to absorb one of these mini Tulpas into itself, and you don't want to let it do that. That's because if you do, it will enter a rage state where it has not only 45% more resistance to all damage types, but it also does much more deadly attacks, normally doing 2 in a row before shrinking itself back down. To stop it from doing this mechanic, you either just continuously defeat the Tulpa so there's none around for it to absorb, or you defeat the Tulpa mid-absorption. This will then stagger the boss for a moment as you interrupted it. You need to keep in mind that from when it starts this absorption animation, you only have about 4 seconds before it's fully absorbed, so you have to react quickly. If you're in melee range right next to the Tulpa, it can be quite annoying to go and find the mini Tulpa, whether it's behind it and you can't actually see it, or even if you try to hit it with an ability and the ability collides with the hitbox of the Tulpa instead of the mini Tulpa. So just try to keep in the back of your mind where the mini Tulpas are at all times. To defeat the mini Tulpas, there's a couple of ways of doing it. First of all, you can just do it technically with damage because they have about 10% of the HP of the boss, but because they have a Hydro ward that's only worth a single unit of Hydro, breaking that ward will instantly defeat them, and this normally happens before you damage them enough. 1 unit of Hydro simply means you need 2 applications of Anemo, Pyro, or Geo, 1 of Cryo, even less than 1 of Dendro, or 2 separate hits of Electro, because Electro Charge will take some time to drain it. Because they're so low, if you're playing something like a Pyro team, you can kind of preemptively damage the Tulpa once, so that when you damage it a second time, it's instantly defeated. But keep in mind then you could accidentally defeat the Tulpa, meaning you're not able to stagger it. Staggering it doesn't really provide much of an advantage anyway though. This is because the mini Tulpas will also be firing projectiles at you while you're alive, so leaving them alive is not really beneficial. These projectiles are tracking and do a little bit of damage. It's enough that it's worth defeating them. But if you manage to defeat a mini Tulpa while its projectile is heading towards you, the projectile projectile will just instantly disappear. Apart from Dendro and Cryo characters that defeat the Tulpas in one hit, some Pyro characters are really good at defeating them as well. Bennett with his skill will defeat one in one hit because Bennett applies 2 units of Pyro with his skill. Chevrus's skill, where she aims down a sight, also applies 1 unit of Pyro, but because she also has an Osea application of Pyro damage, that will also technically count as a hit and defeat the Tulpa with 1 skill. The last thing that I want to talk about for the Tulpa is about how to reduce its resistances, because obviously Viridescent won't work like normally. The source of characters that can reduce resistances in the game in other ways though, one of the most popular being Chevrus, because she reduces enemies' resistance to Electro and Pyro as long as you're consistently triggering overloads. Shilin as well reduces resistance based upon her teammates and not the reactions that she triggers. Zhongli also reduces resistances by a lesser amount, but to any enemies that are near you while you're shielded. Farazan is able to reduce the resistances of enemies to Anemo damage with her ability, and Citlali is able to reduce resistances of enemies to Pyro and Hydro damage, not that Hydro damage is relevant here. Lastly, for Dendro teams, whether that's Dendro damage or Hyper Blooms, you just use Deepwood and that reduces enemies' resistances. So there's lots of different ways of reducing resistances that doesn't use Viridescent. But hopefully that's plenty of information to get you through the Tulpa, and we can start looking at the second side. On the second side, the boss has high Electro resistance, so you don't want that as your main source of damage. On top of that, there's an Electro Lector, so they'll have a big Electro ward, so you need ways to defeat the Electro ward. Pyro, Dendro, and Cryo will be best at this. Hydro can work, but it's not recommended. And lastly, the boss also has a mechanic with an Electro ward. It doesn't protect itself, but it helps a lot to be able to defeat it. This ward also can't be depleted by Hydro damage, so it's even less recommended to take. So you'll definitely need some source of Pyro, Dendro, or Cryo to deal with it. So we had them in last Abyss, but this time it's on its own. Let's look at the Abyss Lector Violet Lightning. It does always have 2 stages. First you deplete their health bars down to 20%, and then they will summon a ward, and then you need to deplete the ward to defeat them. When I'm talking about wards as well, a ward is simply a shield on an enemy, whereas a shield I generally refer to as a Zhongli shield, something on a player. So after you've depleted its HP bar, the Abyss Lector will summon a ward of 36 units. That means you'll need 36 applications of Pyro, Dendro, or Cryo, as they all remove generally 1 unit. Hydro removes about 0.4 over time, as we've talked about with Electro Charge before. You also need to be wary of some of its attacks, specifically the ones that look like it's firing Electro Orbs. This is because when these hit you and deal damage to you, they also drain energy from all the characters in the party. And so if you're pretty reliant on burst, it's important to dodge them. The only character that we have that's not affected by this currently is Malwika, because she doesn't use energy for her burst, she uses Fighting Spirit. So I talked about this a lot in depth last video, but I still want to cover it here, is that elemental application is important for breaking wards. Different characters apply different rates and different amounts of elements with their skills and abilities. For example, Bennett's skill applies 2 units of Pyro, so it's going to remove double the amount of an element on a ward. Xiangling's skill has no ICD, which means every time it hits an enemy, it's applying a reaction, and therefore removing an element. But if you're just normal attacking on a character with normal ICD, like Yoimiya, you'll only end up triggering a reaction every 3 hits, or every 2.5 seconds, and these things work independently. As I said, I went over this much thoroughly earlier. I'll again link the same things down below to the Genshin wiki, showing you the different ICD for different characters and the different elemental application that they have. But essentially you need to make sure that you have a good amount of application of these elements. Characters famously that are very good at depleting Electro wards are something like Bennett because of his high application and his burst, even combining that with someone like Jean for Sunfire, Xiangling of course because of her constant application, Ayaka's movement ability and her burst both apply a hell of a lot of Cryo, so they're good for breaking these wards, and Nahida herself, when her skill triggers, it applies 1.5 units of Dendro, so that's another great tool for breaking this. But really, as long as you're bringing the elements that are recommended, you should be good. So once you've defeated the Lector, you're onto the boss, which is the Millennial Pearl Seahorse. The Millennial Pearl Seahorse has 60% resistance to Electra. For the first few seconds of combat, it has super resistance, so 210 resistance to all elements, so don't bother wasting your big damage right at the start. Very soon into the combat, it will summon a Pearl worth 19 units of Electro. Wait until you can see its HP bar before using all of your elemental application to try to break it, otherwise you won't be able to hit it. And as we already said, you can't break this with Hydro, so Cryo, Dendro, and Pyro will be your best options. It also can't be hit by swirls, so that means Kazuha's swirling things or Jean's Sunfire won't be able to break the Pearl quickly. Along with Hydro application and swirls, there seems to be some other weird interactions with this Pearl. For example, Nahida's skill, which you'd usually used to mark the enemy and deal 1.5 units of Dendro to the Pearl, and it would do this every so often, but for some reason it decides not to affect the Pearl whatsoever. Xiangling's burst also won't hit this, but the startup animation of her burst will. All of Kaya's and Rosaria's abilities will hit it, but the most effective way I found of dealing with it, Tighnari, because Tighnari has a crazy amount of Dendro hits in his kit, and Burning also works amazingly well because you're constantly sustaining a Pyro aura on the enemy, which will damage the Pearl. While it has the Pearl summoned, it also gains 90% resistance to all damage types, so it's pretty important that you try to break this Pearl. When the Pearl drops below 7 of those 19 units of Electro, it will enter its main mechanic. During this, it will summon 3 hearts of 0.4 units of Electro around the arena evenly. 0.4 units is like nothing, so this just means any application of Cryo, Dendro, or Pyro should break them. And destroying each of the hearts will cause the Pearl to lose a third of its remaining health point. It's much easier to just try and break these hearts around the edge of the arena rather than hitting it in the air, but if you do get the Pearl really low, it might be worth just trying to break the Pearl instead with a ranged attack if you have that as an option. You have in total 15 seconds to complete this mechanic, and if you don't complete this mechanic in time, for each heart that remains, the Pearl will recover a third of its HP plus 2 units, so if you don't break any of them, it will get 25 units in total, which is more than it started with. On the other hand, if you successfully complete the mechanic and destroy the Pearl, it will be resummoned about 20 seconds later, but have a lot less durability. About 7.6 units, about a third. Of course, after you break the Pearl, it will be paralyzed for about 5 seconds and lose all those resistances it had gained from summoning the Pearl. As a quick note, if you do break the Pearl before this mechanic, or while this mechanic is going on, it will have the same reaction where the Pearl is destroyed for 20 seconds and it becomes paralyzed. As I mentioned previously, there's some great ways to break these wards, from Nahida to Xiangling, Bennett, Ayaka, etc, etc. How has it already been 20 minutes and I've only got through Chamber 1? I even cut stuff out of this guy. Right, let's have a look at Chamber 2. Chamber 2 is once again very single target. You have a boss and 3 waves of single target enemies on the other side. Returning on the first side is the Secret Source Automaton configuration device. I also need some help with naming this because I've seen that they are adding another Secret Source Automaton in the future, but it's a different type, so I can't just call it the Automaton because that will be confusing. Configuration device does not have a good ring to it either. If you have any good ideas for naming this, feel free to put them down in the comments. The tips specifically for the Automaton are that single target damage, we've already been over that. Night Soul is helpful to bring, so characters that can enter the Night Soul blessing state specifically. You'll also need a way to deal with its pillar mechanic, although a lot of characters can do this. So I did cover this pretty in depth last time, but I'll still cover those things this episode. So first of all, it has naturally high resistances, 60% to all damage types. We'll only lose those resistances after the main mechanic. Main mechanic will happen about 30 to 40 seconds into combat, which is around 2 to 3 attacks. If you have characters that can enter the Night Soul blessing state on your team though, you can make that main mechanic happen a lot faster. This is because even if they're off field, it will fill up this adaptive countermeasures meter, which is the circle next to the health bar. If you have a lot of characters in Night Soul blessing state, it can reduce the time it takes to get to this mechanic by 20 seconds, because having multiple characters will charge this even faster. But there's not a huge difference between 1 and 4 for the overall damage to the chamber, as long as your character can spend at least 14 seconds in the Night Soul blessing state. Unfortunately, Pyromane Traveler can only enter this for 13 seconds, meaning it takes them 2 skills to fully fill up that bar, which will take a while. The other note is that it doesn't really matter where you are in the chamber. You can be really close to the automaton, or you can be far away to dodge its attacks, it will still fill up the bar. But what happens when you do fill up this adaptive countermeasures meter? Well, it will move over to one side of the arena and always do an attack where it draws 2 sets of parallel lines in a box, and the corners of that box that it drew towards the center of the arena will be where it will then spawn 2 Phlogiston pillars. This also means though that if it's done 3 attacks and it's about to enter the mechanic, and you fill up its adaptive countermeasures meter, it will then perform this extra attack where it draws these parallel lines. If you don't fill up the adaptive countermeasures meter, it will simply move over to the side of the arena and then instantly summon the Phlogiston pillars. On top of that, when you fill up the adaptive countermeasures meter, it will interrupt the attack that it's doing. And an important note for existing in the Night Soul blessing state is that some characters like Veressa or Zhilanen, by not using their abilities, can last in that state for longer. For example, if you do 2 plunge attacks on Veressa, you'll enter the Night Soul blessing state and you can just chill, not doing anything else. You won't be able to do any damage while you're doing this, but you will fill up the adaptive countermeasures meter, and so you'll get to the main mechanic faster. Same thing applies for Zhilanen. While her skill does last a shorter amount of time and not indefinitely, you can exist for it longer by not attacking while she's got her skill. So let's talk about the main mechanic then. So as we said, whether you fill up that countermeasures meter or you just let it get to the mechanic, it will always move to one side of the arena first, and then summon 2 Phlogiston pillars towards the center of the arena. Each of these Phlogiston pillars will have a node at the top of it. What's special about Phlogiston pillars? Well, Phlogiston pillars mean that only certain characters can climb them like cliff, as in you're hanging onto a vertical side. And while you might think those nodes at the top you can just hit with ranged attacks, you can't, because they have a barrier surrounding them about the size of the pillar itself. This blocks any projectiles from hitting them, and therefore the only way of breaking these nodes, which you need to complete the mechanic, is by getting to the top of these pillars. I'm going to put up a quick tier list now of the characters that can climb the pillars with their abilities, but there is a whole video I have showing off characters doing this. On top of that, in that video I mentioned that while it might seem like most characters need some kind of movement ability to get to the top, there's actually little ledges on the side of the pillar that characters can hop up onto, because you're not climbing anything, you're just getting on a horizontal surface. So even if you don't have a character with a movement ability, technically you are able to do this. The only dangerous part is that during this mechanic there will also be 2 little lasers trying to shoot at you, then create little puddles of electro on the ground, which do quite a lot of damage. Generally, as soon as you've elevated yourself in some way, whether that's on top of Zhongli's pillar or flying as Shaska, they stop hitting you, but they can be quite deadly if you're trying to do the mechanic where you jump up on the ledge and it takes you a few attempts. Lastly, you have about 12 seconds to break both of these cores before it will do a huge arena-wide high damage attack. The only characters that I didn't include in that video were Lanyan, because I missed it, which I will show now, where you simply use her skill to ascend, and then instead of attacking once you've got to the top, you glide, because attacking means you'll be attacking from outside of the range of the barrier and you'll end up landing again without having hit any, whereas you can just glide and land on top of the pillar. Veressa, on the other hand, is a lot easier to do this with because you just do a charged attack. She'll headbutt the ground and get up high enough to get on top of the pillars at any height. You don't need to look for a special ledge. Now, even though this automaton does have a really large HP pool, doing this mechanic is very rewarding because it will lose 15% of its max health. On top of that, its resistances will then be reduced by 90% down to -30, and it will be paralyzed for 15 seconds. If it's below 15% health and you complete this mechanic, it gets defeated by it. And as soon as it's finished this downtime, or if you miss the mechanic, it will start all over again, meaning multiple phases can reward you for taking Natlan characters because you're shortening the time to get to this main mechanic multiple times. And that should be everything. I think most of the rest of the combat should be quite simple, so let's have a look at side 2. Side 2, you're facing 1 common enemy and then 2 elites. You don't really want to rely on electro damage because the Wyob has high resistance to electro damage. You don't want to rely on pyro damage because the Avatar of Lava has high pyro resistance. Night Soul for the damage boost of the Wyob, or Pyro, Dendro, or Cryo to break its ward can be useful. Just like with the Tulpa, you'll get free reactions against the Avatar of Lava, and lastly, for the Fontaine mech, it can be useful to bring some Ozia. And the first enemy you'll be facing is the Fontaine mech, the Suppression Specialist mech Numeraligned. There's only one significant note for this mech, which is applying 2 instances of Osea will disable its strong attack, although it won't make you do any more damage. Characters that can apply Osea that are relevant are Wriothesley, Chevreuse, and Lynette. After that, you're onto the Avatar of Lava. As we mentioned, it has 70% pyro resistance and a constant pyro aura. This means you can get free overloads on it, you can get free melts and vaporizes, so Cryo and Hydro characters will benefit a lot here. It will also be, just like the Tulpa, difficult to trigger certain kinds of reactions. Something I noticed a lot during my 4-star run, which is just as apparent as previous Abysses, is that the Avatar of Lava will happily just teleport away from where you are. The only way to stop them doing this is to keep them constantly staggered. So if you have a team with a lot of location dependent abilities like Rosaria Burst and Bennett Burst, then you need to keep this in mind. Staggering it is easy with overload, or just certain attacks with a lot of blunt force. After that, we're facing a Wyob, and we've faced them in the past 2 Abysses, so hopefully you've got a good feel for them now. This one's the Thundering Wyob Manifestation, which is the Electro version. The Electro version has 50% resistance to all electro damage, and just like the previous Pyro Wyob, after a short moment of about 5 seconds, it will create an arena around itself that constantly drains your whole party's energy, and then you have 13 seconds to break this ward. Of course, as we know, Malwika doesn't use energy, so her burst isn't affected. As you are facing an enemy beforehand, and you have those 5 seconds, you're able to cast your burst before the fight happens. So for characters like Xiangling, who are very reliant on their burst, it can be significant to get all the energy you need beforehand. You can also stall out this ability of it creating the zone by either staggering it or freezing it. Though likely if you do this, after it's returned to a non-stagger state, it will try to create this zone again, unless you've done it for an extended period of time and it decides, no, I don't want to do it anymore. When it does create this zone, it's worth being in it, because all all characters in the zone will get 120% damage boost, and Night Soul damage is then further boosted by another 60%. During this time the zone is active, it will create a white ward on itself, which is just a damage ward. Ward is worth about 112% of its max HP. The important thing about a white ward is that it can't be affected by amplifying reactions like melt or vaporize. It also can't be petrified or frozen while it has the ward up. If you don't break the white ward in time, whatever's remaining it will convert to an electro ward, maximum being about 22.8 units, but it scales as we said depending on how much ward remains. So if there's only 15% of the white ward left, it will only have about 11 units of electro. On the other hand, if you successfully manage to break the white ward, it will drop a whole bunch of energy particles, essentially refunding you all the bursts that you'd lost from the drain. As with the usual energy rules, the character that collects the particles will get the most value, so if you have a high cost burst on someone, make sure they're the ones catching these particles. Either way, if you break the electro ward or the white ward, it will be paralyzed for about 5 seconds. And that's it. On to Chamber 3? Chamber 3 is mostly facing 2 enemies at a time. That doesn't really mean anything. So let's take a look at Side 1. Side 1, we can welcome back more Hydra Aura enemies. If you're only struggling and came to watch Chamber 3, I recommend you go back and watch Chamber 1 because I talk a lot about Hydra Auras for Hydra Tulpa. But going back over the general tips, of course all these enemies are immune to Hydra damage. You're facing specifically 2 enemies at a time, so characters like Beidou, who do really well into specifically 2 enemies at a time, can work well here. And they're doing Hydra attacks, and so if you're standing in Bennett's burst and you have Pyro on you, they get free vaporizers. The Hydro Mimic Boars I have next to no notes for. They can be frozen. Yay! After the Hydro Mimics, you're facing Ninian and Vivian of the Lake. These are particularly angry and tanky Hydro Eidolons. In the Abyss, the Eidolons are already constantly engaged. That means they do more deadly attacks and they can't be frozen. As far as trying to group the Eidolons goes, it's pretty simple. You go stand next to the taller Eidolon, the more humanoid one. This is because the shorter one will try and do melee attacks, whereas the taller one does ranged attacks. So the shorter one will move towards you, whilst the melee one won't. As long as you go stand next to the taller ranged Eidolon, the melee one will naturally move towards you. On the second side, we have again 3 waves of elites. The general tips of this is that multiple of the enemies here have high Hydro resistance, so taking Hydro damage is not recommended. I really don't want you to use Nervla at this Abyss. One of the enemies has high Anemo resistance, so that's not as good. Can bring freeze to weaken one of the enemies, and one of the enemies also has higher physical resistance. So first of all, you're facing 2 Joawen beasts. The Joawen beasts generally naturally make their way towards you, so you don't have to worry about grouping too much. Also have 50% resistance to Anemo and Hydro damage. They do have a specific mechanic where if you freeze them and then trigger a reaction on them, just like with the Swanee, it will temporarily paralyze them. After defeating them, you're facing a Primordial Baptismal Bishop. A Bishop has 30% resistance to Hydro and physical damage. The only prominent attack that the Bishop has is one where it will try to absorb energy from your characters. I think this also only affects the active character. If your character on the other hand has no energy remaining, it will do double the damage with this attack, which is quite funny because Mawika, as we know, has no energy, so she always takes double damage from this attack. Lastly, you're facing a Consecrated Beast, a Consecrated Horned Crocodile. This has a base 40% resistance to all elements and 70% resistance to Hydro damage, so taking elemental resistant Shred can be quite significant. It will roll all over the place with its attacks, and eventually do an attack where it spawns rings of Hydra on the ground underneath you. After it's performed this attack, it will always summon a phagocytic energy block, and this will last for 6 seconds. The block can be destroyed by one single application of Hydro, or by 6 non-Hydro but elemental attacks. So you can either break this with Hydro, very quick elemental application, or if you have a Hydro character that's able to swirl elements off themselves, like a Kazuha Burst, you make sure to get hit by the Hydro attack with the rings and then you use your burst and it will instantly break it. Once it's destroyed, the active character will obtain a status that lasts for 10 seconds. And while this status is active, all party members will lose 2% of their HP every second. That only amounts to 20% in total. While you have the status, any attack that hits the enemy will then consume the status and cause the Consecrated Beast to lose 15% of its max HP and become paralyzed for 10 seconds. If you don't manage to break this block though, don't worry, because it will shortly soon perform this same attack, again resummoning the block. Along with this, some other notes are that of course it's going to do Hydro attacks, so beware when you're standing in Bennett's Burst. It also has reduced freeze resistance, so it only gets frozen for 50% of the time if you're trying to freeze it. And I think that should be everything. We spent a long time talking about the bosses, and hopefully those last few chambers were a bit simpler. So let's look into team. As usual, the teams that I'm going to mention here are not the only options, they're just what I think would be fun to play based upon the challenges the Abyss has given us. And if you want more ideas, there's lots of videos on YouTube of great clears. On top of that, these are just recommendations that I think make good use of the blessings and the buffs, but teams like Malwika might be able to just one-shot everything. If you do have strong characters you like playing, feel free to play them. Anyway, let's take a look, if we're doing a continuous run, what the problems are, what the recommendations and the restrictions would be. So the recommendations this Abyss are kind of awkward, because the Abyss blessings and the Leyline disorders aren't that useful. For example, the Abyss blessing is giving us that extra shockwave of true damage when we trigger cryo reaction. The Leyline disorder is giving us geo skill damage, which is really going to end up with quite limited options. Navia doesn't really have great cryo characters to go in her teams. Instead, what I want to more focus on for this recommendation specifically is the mechanics of the enemies and the Hydro aura. On top of that, of course, we don't want to bring Hydro damage almost at all, because both the first and the last chamber are completely immune to Hydro damage. For the first chamber, for the boss, bringing some Electro, Pyro, Cryo, or Dendro to deal with the mechanic is useful. There's a lot of single target content. For the boss in the second chamber, some Night Soul and a way to deal with climbing the Phlogiston pillars is going to be good. And for the last chamber, because we're facing 2 enemies at a time, characters that are good against 2 enemies will be noted. But let's take a look at some teams. This isn't any specific order, we're just going to look at some different archetypes. First one that I mentioned I would talk about back in the Tulpa section was a spread team. Now a spread team is usually Dendro damage characters supported by Electro reaction. The most popular versions of this are normally Alhaitham and Tighnari, but those teams aren't very prevalent. But that interacts differently this Abyss. This is because of the Hydro aura. So those Dendro characters are going to apply Dendro to the Hydro, and you get plumes off. Then if you're running an Electro support character to help you trigger spread reactions like you would normally do, if that Electro character is able to build Elemental Mastery and explode those blooms, you're getting free Hyper Blooms, and you're increasing your damage by a lot. You already have Deepwood in the team, because you're doing Dendro damage as your main source of damage, and lastly, because of the special way that the reactions work with the Hydro aura, you actually get more blooms. It's because putting Electro on the enemy will allow Hydro and Electro to coexist. Then when you apply Dendro to this, first of all, you trigger a bloom from the Hydro. Well, what happens with the Electro? Well, Dendro and Electro react to create a Quicken aura. Normally mean when your Dendro character attacks an enemy that has a Quicken aura, they'll do some extra damage. But because this is an aura, it acts like Dendro existing on the enemy. So that actually gets consumed and turned into a second bloom. I think one of the benefits I wanted to mention about spread teams is that they'll work really well in both the first and the second chamber and the third. Even though their playstyles are a little bit different, the builds end up being pretty identical. On the other hand, you can reverse that and you can play an aggravate team. Maybe you're playing Cloran, Fish, or Nahida. Nahida procs some hyper blooms on the enemy, Cloran gets free tasers, and because she's on field and doing electro damage, it's very possible that she's able to trigger those hyper bloom. You can then slot in Iansan or Jillanan in these teams to deal with the second chamber. Hyper bloom teams should also be pretty good this side. The main problem being that any Hydro characters you're bringing along to deal damage won't be able to do anything in the first and the last chamber. But you'll still be getting the same number of blooms, and if that's your main source of damage, that's what should matter. As we talked about for the reaction orientation, bloom teams can be good, but you have to play them in different ways. So in the first chamber, you'll have to build your Dendro characters with Elemental Mastery, as they'll be the one triggering the blooms. As usual, Burgeon and Bloom teams are pretty good into multi-target, but not as good in single target. Only because that reaction damage is able to hit multiple enemies, but you have multiple enemies to trigger those reactions off. But they might struggle with the single target damage a bit in the first and the second chamber. What I think will be some of the most popular teams this Abyss are Overload teams. Overload teams should work perfectly well in the first and the last chamber, as well as the second. This is because whether you're using an Electro carry or a Pyro carry, they're still able to get overloads on the enemy. And Chevreus will then further reduce the resistances of all those Hydro enemies, without needing to trigger a swell or something like that. Pyro characters even beyond that will be able to get all those free vaporizers, which are very valuable. Okay, let's take a look at Geo teams now, because the Leyline disorder is all about Geo skill damage. Mono Geo is an older team now. It might be viable because you could run something like Albedo and Chiori and make them use of all those blessings. Zhongli also has his universal resistance shred, and Geo Resonance reduces enemies' resistance to Geo damage even further, so it might be viable. But more than that, I think there's two of the best teams that use some Geo characters. What I think will be the team that makes the most of all the advantages, this Abyss specifically, is a Melt team with a Geo core. A Geo core is something that's been around for quite a while in Genshin, and it has surges of popularity as different characters are released. Geo core conceptually is two characters in the center that don't really interact or affect how the rest of the team work. It provides some stable damage, some buffs, and Geo Resonance that buffs all characters' damage by 15%. At least while you're shielded. This means you can use a Geocore like Jillian and Albedo or Chiori or Zhongli or any combination of those, grab the buffs they provide, and Albedo and Chiori make great use of the leyline disorders, and then around that you also would like to take a cryo character. So you can make a great melt team, especially with Citlali. Citlali gives you a shield, allows you to trigger cryo reactions for the leyline disorder, reduces enemies' resistance just depending on her damage to pyro damage, and then you can fill this out with any number of pyro carries. And in a melt team, even Albedo's elemental mastery that he gives you from your burst is useful. Even though you're not necessarily getting melts against the first and the last chamber, you're still getting vaporizes, so the elemental mastery is still useful. And then in the second chamber, you just play it like a regular melt team. If you take Jillian, Citlali, or even Marwika as your pyro carry, they can also deal with the mechanics of the automaton. So, as I said, I really like this team conceptually because they make use of so many of the buffs that you're given, while meeting all the requirements for all the chambers. On the other hand, the other team that I think will be really successful this Abyss is, of course, Navia. Navia gets so much value from the skill damage. Navia also synergizes incredibly well with another Geo character to generate either more crystallizes or for the resistance shred that someone like Jillian will bring. And then because the first and last chamber have constant Hydro auras, you don't need to worry too much about your elemental application, and you can just take characters that will be good at dealing with those chambers and good damage for Navia. Could take Bennett and Marwika. Get a lot of vaporized damage in that first and last chamber from Marwika. If you have Jillian, then you're able to charge up Marwika's burst very quickly, and the second chamber's a cinch when you have enough Natlan characters. But at the same time, you could just take Kachina. Kachina on a scroll set will buff your Geo damage, she's got Night Soul, and she can climb the pillars. So Navia should be pretty comfortable this Abyss. The only thing you're really missing out on is a Cryo character. I mean, you could take Cryo sub DPS, or just slot in like a Citlali alongside Marwika as supports to get more elemental reactions. You will get less in the second chamber because the Pyro and the Cryo will cancel each other out, but should still be enough to get you through. Anmo Driver team should also be pretty okay this Abyss. Both Wanderer and Xiao have an easy time climbing the pillars, but more than that, Farazan's ability to reduce any enemy's resistance to Anemo damage is going to be really helpful. And she doesn't need to trigger a reaction to make this happen. The bigger issue is that generally for Xiao and Wanderer, you do like to take Farina in their teams as supports. If you happen to have Eon-san, she's also going to be a great character to bring. You don't even have to worry necessarily about Eon-san's scroll not buffing Anemo because she wouldn't be able to do that anyway. Of course, we've already touched on it, but both Vaporize with Pyro carries and Melt teams with Pyro carries should be really good. Vape teams, the Hydro character's not going to be doing much in those first and last chambers. The Pyro characters getting all those reactions still should be really beneficial, and it means you can build elemental mastery on those characters and make the most of it without worrying that in that second chamber, the elemental mastery will be going to waste. Now, you could play cryo teams as the best. You could use someone like Jillian or Zhongli to reduce their resistances to cryo damage. You're not going to be triggering freeze. Blizzard's Trayer won't work on the enemy. Maybe you thought, okay, I'll bring Farina for these, but then she's kind of useless in that first and last chamber because she's not doing any damage. So there might be some orientation of Mono Cryo that would work, but I wouldn't recommend it. Lastly, we have Mono Pyro. Mono Pyro should also be really good this Abyss. Something like a Linny Mono Pyro will be able to get loads of free reactions, amplifying his damage in those first and last chambers, and in the second chamber, because you're planning to play Mono Pyro anyway, it doesn't really matter that there's Pyro on the enemy. Okay? Side 2. Now, Side 2 is even more awkward than Side 1 because the recommendations based upon the Leyline disorder and the Abyss Blessing are funky. As we said at the start of the video, there's not a single character in the game that can make use of cryo skill damage being buffed, so we just have the cryo reaction bonus. So instead, like the previous chamber, I'm going to focus on teams that are good at dealing with the mechanics in those first few chambers rather than anything else. So let's look at those mechanics. Let's look at the recommendations and requirements. So first of all, you won't want to play Electro as your main source of damage because of the first and the second chamber. It's also recommended and required that you bring some way to deal with Electro wards, whether that's Pyro, Cryo, or Dendro. You probably won't want Hydro because Hydro is not great at dealing with Electro wards, and the last chamber has multiple opponents with high resistance to it. You can choose to avoid Pyro, but there's only one enemy with high resistance, so it's not as significant. The same goes for Anemo. You could bring some Night Soul for the YOP, and some Hydro or Cryo to get those free reactions off the Avatar of Lava, Freeze for the Joaowen beasts. But as you can see, those are a lot less significant than the necessity to break those Electro wards. If we want to take a team that's specifically good at dealing with Electro wards, what have we got? Well, we have Melt to start. Melt brings Cryo and Pyro, and both of them deal very well with Electro wards. You also have enough Cryo applications so that you can make use of the Abyss Blessing, whether that's forward Melt like Marwika with Citlali, or a reverse Melt team like Wriothesley or Ganyu. Going a step further, you can take those reversed melt teams because you want Pyro to last on the enemy for a long time while you're doing all your cryo damage, and put a Dendro character in there for burning. The Dendro helps the Pyro be sustained, and then you have Pyro, Dendro, and Cryo for breaking the shields, which is again, great options. If you take out the Cryo from those teams, you're left with burning teams, and of course Kniche will be good there. Whereas the Pyro damage orientated melt teams might struggle a bit more against the Avatar of Lava, there's no enemies with really high Cryo or Dendro resistance. So Reverse Melt and Kniche face no problems. Hyper Bloom should also be pretty viable because you have Dendro application, you have slow Electro application that's limited to make sure you just get your Hyper Blooms, but any team that really has enough Dendro application should be good to go because Dendro will deal with those Electro wards. Could then extend that to spread teams, or Bloom teams, or Burgeon teams. The usual problem with Burgeon and Bloom teams being that they're a lot less single target focused than something like Hyper Bloom, and so because we're almost always facing a single enemy at a time, they will be less effective. Mono Cryo or Freeze teams will do a lot better this side than the previous side, because Ayaka or Cryo characters in general, or that Cryo application is going to be great for dealing with those wards. As long as you're not relying a lot on Hydro damage for that last chamber. In the second chamber, you'll get free melts on the Avatar of Lava, you'll be able to stall out the mechanic of the YOP, and you might even get to do the special mechanic of the Joaowen beasts. If we take a look at what other teams can work with burning, there is a character that has very slow Hydro application, which is Mualani. Mualani quite likes burning teams. Her Hydro application won't be as useful herself for depleting those wards, but that's not really as important because you're focusing on breaking the wards with the Dendro and the Pyro character. The only issue will be the high Hydro resistance in that last chamber. Then lastly, we have teams like Mono, Pyro, and Overload, which will play in pretty similar ways. Overload, the condition being that you're going to have to mainly depend on your Pyro characters because you want a tiny amount of Electro application, enough so that you can trigger overloads, but not so much that it will harm your ability to break those Electro wards. Xiangling and Bennett in those teams are great at breaking those wards, so they should be perfectly fine. And I think that's all of my suggestions for teams for second side. Wow, how does every single one of these videos keep getting longer? Thank you for sticking around if you watched it all, and I hope you enjoyed yourself. If you made it all the way here, then maybe you enjoyed this video and you'd like to subscribe? But if not, no worries, I just hope you found it helpful. If you did manage to get 36 stars or do better than ever before, let me know. I love seeing those comments. And if you need anything else, you can join my Discord, which rarely gets used, or my stream, which I rarely do. Thank you for all the continued support, and have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye! P.S. Quick reminder for the Kickstarter Wiggle Genshin merch thing.